Welcome to another tutorial. In this one, we're going to build a product landing page and sell access to a digital product. This front end is built with React, and we're using PayPal payments and then listening for an event from PayPal to tell us that the payment is successful, which then gives the user access to the product that they purchased. So just on the front end, what this looks like is if I click to pay, I then log in with my sandbox credentials and I can pay for that product. And once this is successful, we can see a message that's displayed here that just tells us that it was successful. Otherwise, it'll show us if it was canceled or if there was an error. And we'll also get an email with a link to the product. So this is what we're going to be building. Now, to follow along, you can use the Django React PayPal GitHub repository. You can find all of the code from this video in the master branch. And if you prefer to read this tutorial instead of watch it as a video, you can go to the justdjango.com blog, and there you'll find the PayPal payments tutorial, and you can read through this tutorial. It's quite comprehensive, 15-minute read, but we're covering pretty much exactly the same thing in this video. You'll also find all of the links in the description of this video. So with that being said, let's get started. Before we get into the code, I do want to bring up learn.justdjango.com. There's over 60 hours of Django material here to help you become a professional Django developer. So if you want to upskill and you want a resource that's going to help you get to the level of understanding that you'd need to work in a professional setting as a Django developer, then consider this resource. Thanks for listening, and let's get to the tutorial. So the first thing you need to do is create a PayPal account. Now, when you create the account, make sure that you specify it's a business account, because that's going to give you access to all of the tools and links that you need to actually accept payments, as well as subscriptions and all these other offerings that come with using PayPal. If you already have an account and it's a personal account, you can also upgrade it to a business account. It's all free. So you can just do that in your profile settings and go to the business and upgrade it to a business account. So you need to do that in order to follow along. And once you have that, then you can go and log in. So I'm going to go and log in now. Now, once you're logged in, you can navigate to developer.paypal.com. And this is going to take you to everything about using the PayPal API, accepting payments. It's got all the documentation. And so under Docs in the navigation, you can go to Overview. Specifically under Developer Resources, if you click on Get Started, this is going to have a section on getting your API credentials. And this is really important. You need API credentials to, actually interact or use the PayPal API. And so here you'll see there's 4 steps. So first you need to log into the developer dashboard, which we are. So I'm going to click to open that link in a different tab. And you'll see that it brings us to also developer.paypal.com, but it navigates us to a specific place here, /developer/applications. And this is really the central place of managing your sandbox and your live credentials for the API. So it's really important. You're going to come back here over and over. And so under your apps and credentials, you will have a default application by default. So this should be created, but if you don't have one, you can just create an app. And once you go into that app, then you'll see there's a bunch of credentials that show up here. You have a sandbox account, a client ID, and a secret. So you're going to want to copy the client ID and the secret for now. Just make sure you've got it stored somewhere, because we're going to use that in the Django project as well as in the React front end. So you will need these values. Secondly, if you go here under Sandbox, you can click on Accounts. Once this loads, you'll see Sandbox Test Accounts. You'll have a test account for the business account and a test account for the personal account. So the business account is basically where you would have all the products that you're going to sell. And then the personal account is the account that would buy that you would use to test the payment, to actually make the payment. So on one account, you'll be able to see that the money is received, and on the other account, you'll see that the money went out and was sent. So both of these accounts are important, and you will log in with this email address and the password for it in the sandbox when you make a payment. So you basically just go over here, view edit account, and you'll see a password displaying as well as the email, and you can copy both the account details for the business and the personal accounts, because again, you're going to need them, and PayPal logs you out quite frequently if you're not active on this page. So it's just handy to have these written down on the side, well, noted down on the side. So with that, you'll have all the credentials that you need to get started. And in terms of logging into the sandbox, you can open up sandbox.paypal.com and you can then log into the sandbox. It looks exactly like normal PayPal when you log in. It's just, this is not a real account. It's the business account that I'm logged into right now. So you can see how much has been received. And likewise, you can log into the sandbox personal account and see how much you've paid. To make testing the payment process a little bit easier, I'm just going to log out of here, because when we test the payments, we are basically logging in with the personal account. So we don't need to be logged in to the business account, but just showing you that the sandbox.paypal.com website is also where you can log in and you can manage things on the business side over there. So quite a few things that you need to have set up with PayPal. But once you've got the API credentials, you've got your sandbox accounts, then you should be good to go. So jumping into VS Code, I don't have a project yet. I'm going to create the project, and I'm going to use Django Cookie Cutter to bootstrap the project. And if you haven't seen my video on setting up Docker using the Cookie Cutter Django project, then you'll see a little card shown here in the top right, which you can click to view that video. And otherwise, we can just continue. So inside the downloads folder, I'm going to use the Cookie Cutter project. I've already got it installed. So I'm going to generate that project using the Cookie Cutter command, pointing to the GitHub repository, Cookie Cutter Django. So I'm going to go and run that command. And I'll download the latest version just to make sure that it is up to date, but it should be. And then I'll just bring this up. Okay, so now we specify the project name, which I'll just call Django React PayPal. And then we're going to go through all of the prompts, and really all we want to do is specify to use Docker because it's convenient. And you could also specify to use Django REST framework, which I'll just include, but we aren't actually interacting with the API. So you can run through all the default options, and then that will generate the project. And now I'll just open this up in VS Code. Great, so now I have it here. And once we have that, we can either run the project locally with a virtual environment, or you can just use Docker. And I think Docker is a lot more convenient. So to start off with that, we just run docker compose, pass in the local.yaml file, and then build. So that's going to build all of the images. We then run the up command, and we can see all of the containers being created. So we have Postgres, docs, and then all the Django migrations being applied and server running. And right now the version is 3.1.13, which is the latest version from the Cookie Cutter Django project. So if you're watching this in the future and there's a different version, you might want to just force install version 3.1.13 and then follow the tutorial, and after the tutorial upgrade to the latest version at the time you're watching this video. But okay, so we have the Django server running. So we could open this in the browser, and there we go. So we can see that's running. And now what we're going to do is create the React project. And we're going to do this inside of the Django project, just because it's easier to demonstrate it if it's inside the same folder. But you could set this up in a lot of different ways. You could have the React project by itself in its own repository, or you could do a mono repository where they're both in the same repository. And so we're just going to do it like that. So inside the Django React PayPal folder, you'll find the templates folder as well as all of the Django apps for this project. So we're just going to put the React project inside of here because this is where all of the contents of the project go. So I'm just going to open another tab, and we'll go and create that inside this folder. So I'm going to go into that folder, and we're going to use the create React app project to bootstrap the React project for us. And so you use npx, which is the command to basically create the folder. Now you need to have Node installed and you need to have npm installed. Npm comes installed with Node. So just make sure that you have Node installed on your computer. You can do that by just typing node-v and it'll show you the version. You can see right now mine is version 16. And then we can also type npm-v and you can see the version of npm that I'm using. Now with those two, we're going to create the React project by using the npx command. And we can also use templates. If we go to get started, you can go to selecting a template and you'll see you just pass in -- template. And for example, you could use TypeScript, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to create this project using a TypeScript template. So you can just copy this command and we'll then come and paste this back in here and just change this my app to be called, in this case, we'll just call it front end. So it's obvious that this is the React project. And this also takes a while just to bootstrap the project. Okay, there we go. So that's done. Now I'm just going to open the front end folder, go into source, and I'm going to go to package.json. And here we'll be able to see the version right now is version 17.0.2. Now, if we just change into that front end folder, you can run npm run start, and this will start the front end server. Or you could Dockerize this, and since we are using Docker, I'll also just show we can see this once the page loads, right? So this is the React front end, but since we're using Docker, we can also Dockerize the React app, and this just might be useful since we do have a local.yaml and all the Docker configurations already. So I'll just show how we can add that into the project. So inside the front end folder, we'll place all of the Docker files that are needed. And that's really just a Docker file. And I'm going to do this inside a compose and then local folder. And this is to basically mimic the way that this compose folder is working as well. So you have compose, local, Django, and I'm putting it inside the front end folder just because it's related to React. So it's not inside the Django compose folder. And then inside local, we'll create the Docker file. Now I'm going to paste the contents in here because I don't want to spend too much time teaching the Docker stuff, but really there's not a lot going on here. We're just using a node image and copying over the package.json and package.lock.json files, which basically store the dependencies for the project. And this is caching those dependencies, so it'll basically build the image a lot faster if you are doing this. Then we install those dependencies, copy over the rest of the files, expose port 3000, and then run the npm run start command. So you can see it's very similar, if not exactly the same as what you would run in your local environment or in your terminal, but now it's just with Docker, and you can basically run the entire container with one command. And we're going to include this inside of the local.yaml file so that it's part of the Docker Compose configuration here. And so you can add another service underneath the doc service, and you can just call it React. And again, I'm pasting this in here just to go through it quicker, but we have a few things that we need to pass in. First, we have the build, which contains context and the Docker file path. And these are really important. We need to specify this because we're basically saying the context, meaning the folder that has all the files that we actually care about, is inside Django, React, PayPal, and then front end. That's the folder we're interested in. And the compose folder and the Docker file, because we need to tell Docker where the Docker file is inside this front end folder, because now that's the context. It's inside compose local Docker file. So that's where it will then find the Docker file. And then we have, same as all of the other services, an image, a container name, and making sure that you expose port 3000 so that you can access it on your host. And so like that, you can then just save the local.yaml file, and coming back to our other terminal, I'm going to stop this because we need to build the new service that's included in the compose file, right? So we'll just run the build command again. Right, now that that's built, again, run the up command and we'll see the React service being built as well. So now we should have 4 services running. Cool, so here we can see localhost 3000. I'm gonna open this up and I can then bring this here and you can see there's the project running on 3000. So now you have React Dockerized. Again, that's up to you, but since everything else is Dockerized, it kind of makes sense to just have everything included. So now you can just run the entire project with one command being, well, 2 commands, the docker build and docker up commands. So that's now the setup for React inside of the Django project. Now we can actually start coding inside of the React front-end project. But before I do that, I just need to explain how the PayPal checkout process actually works and what we're aiming to do here. So there's essentially 4 steps you could view this as. First, the user is going to land on the product landing page. They'll be shown the product and the PayPal button. And once they click on the button, they'll take them through the payment process on PayPal. And if the payment is successful, they get redirected to a success page, or they just get shown some sort of message that indicates it was successful. And at the same time, PayPal will send you a webhook, which is basically an event telling you that the payment was successful. And that event is the most foolproof way to know that the payment actually did occur, because a user could just manually redirect themselves to the success page. And so you can't just trust that landing on the success page means that it was a valid payment. So you have to wait for that event to be sent from PayPal. And once you have the event, then you know it was successful. And from that event, we can send the user an email with the link or the file or whatever the product is that we're selling them. We can send that in the email once we receive the webhook. So those are the steps that we're going for. But first we need to actually bring PayPal into the React front end and actually show the button and a product and all of that. So that's what we're going to work on first. So inside app.tsx, we can actually just remove basically everything because we're not going to be making use of any of this. So we can get rid of app.css, logo, and index we're going to keep, but we'll just end up changing this eventually. Inside app.tsx is where we're going to put a component, which is basically our payment component, and that's going to hold all of the information for the PayPal buttons and the product that we're selling. So inside source, we can create a components folder, and in there we'll add payment.tsx. Now here we're going to create this function which we'll call payment, and we're just going to give it a named export. And then inside here we'll return, for now let's just make it a button, and it says PayPal or pay with PayPal. Right, so that's our payment component. Now we can import this into app.tsx. So we'll say import payment from the components payment file, and then we'll render out the payment component just like that. And we should see there's our button loading in the browser. So that's our component, and we'll gradually start adding more to this component, starting with the actual official PayPal React project. You can find this here on GitHub, PayPal React PayPal JS. This is the project. And you can also click on this link on the side here, and it will take you to what's called Storybook, which is basically a nice way of testing and displaying components. And to install this, you can actually just scroll down here. You can see npm install, and we just install this package here. So you can copy this command, come back into the project. And one thing to note is that when you're working with Docker, once you change the packages, you need to rebuild the project. So just keep that in mind. So I can basically stop the Docker Compose now, and in the meantime, go into the Django React frontend folder and then install that command. So Once we have that installed, we then use the PayPal script provider, which is basically what takes our PayPal client ID, and we wrap this around whatever buttons we're using in the project. So this uses the context API, which basically is used for managing state. So we can grab information from the PayPal script provider inside the PayPal buttons component. We don't have to do any of this, but that's just how it works. So for now, we basically just need the PayPal script provider, and we'll worry about the PayPal buttons in a second. So going into app.tsx, we'll paste everything there and just make sure the imports and everything is correct. So all we need is that part. Right, so the PayPal buttons component I'm going to get rid of, and then I'll put my payments component inside of the script provider like the PayPal buttons component was. But now here where we're specifying the client ID, we need to replace test with our actual client ID, and that's the value that you get from your PayPal dashboard. So we're going to load the value using environment variables, and the way that you do that is by typing process.env, and you can see that you actually already have a node env environment variable, which is by default, and this is either production, development, or test. But we're going to add another one here, and this is going to be the React app PayPal client ID. Now the reason it starts with React app is because all React app environment variables have to start with this. So unfortunately, it just has to be named like that. You can also see that it's undefined, so or string or undefined, but we know that we are going to pass this value in. So what we can do is inside the React app env.d.ts, we can configure what environment variables are going to be available in the project. So you can declare, and this is a TypeScript thing, we declare a namespace which we call Node.js, and we can then export an interface, and an interface basically just looks like a dictionary, and we'll call it process env, and this will contain all of the names of the environment variables and the type of environment variables. And in our case, the first one is React app PayPal client ID, and we know that this is going to be a string, right? So this is very important because now if we come back, we can see that this is being treated without an error. And if we hover over, then you can see it's a string type. So it's no longer undefined or a string, right? So that's really important. But now we need to create an environment variable file, which is where we'll put the value for the client ID. So inside the front end folder, you can create .env.local. Okay, this by default is excluded from the repository. And in there, you'll put React app PayPal client ID, and then go and paste your value over here. So I'm going to go and do that. Great. Okay, so we can now, in my case, go and build the Docker images again. I'll just close some of those terminals. So rebuilding this because of the changes in the dependencies, and this shouldn't take too long to rebuild. Okay, now we run the up command again. That'll start all of the services again. And so now we've configured the PayPal React script provider. Going into the payment component, here we're going to add that PayPal button that we saw, which is, well, PayPal buttons. So we can actually grab everything from here. And right at the top, I'll just paste that. So we only need the PayPal buttons component, and we only need that. So getting rid of everything else, we can do it like this. And the PayPal buttons component has a lot of properties on it. So if you just hold Command and click on that, then you can basically go and take a look at all of the props for this component. But specifically, you can click on PayPal buttons component props, which extends from here, and we can go take a look at this. And this is what we really need to become familiar with. There's a bunch of functions here that actually looks exactly the same as if you were using normal vanilla JavaScript. So the React component is actually just a component of all of those functions available in the vanilla JavaScript version. So you have create billing agreement, create order, create subscription, and all of the other methods. It's just nice that we can see all of the props and what type of props they are. For example, onApprove is a function that's a callback, and it provides you with data, which you can also look at the onApprove data, which has a billing token, order ID, payer ID, all that optional. So you can take a look at everything that is provided to you in all of the methods, and that's really handy. So just something to be aware of. But right now, all we're doing is specifying the style, which is a dictionary that contains, for example, the layout, and we're saying it's horizontal. You can also come here to the storybook and look at all the examples of how to use the component for different use cases. But for now, we're just keeping it simple. And if we refresh the page here, we can see there's the giant PayPal button. And if we were to click it, then it loads up the sandbox PayPal window. But in this case, we're not even selling anything, but it still loads up the sandbox. So we know that this is working. What we can do now is actually just make this look like we're selling a product. So I'm just going to copy in some stuff here, particularly for the CSS and for the product card, essentially. So I'm going to replace everything with all of this. You can also find this in the repository for this project. I'm not going to go into details of it because it's just basics of CSS, and then the same thing for HTML. I'm going to go into my component and just grab some information here. And this is really just making the project look like we're actually selling something. So just to fill the void. But here, of course, you would put the actual image of your product, the actual price, and some real information. But coming back, this is what that looks like now. So we have the actual product being displayed, but nothing's changed in terms of the PayPal component. We still need to pass information in here. And so that's what we're going to do now. The first thing we're going to pass in is just coming back to our components, is the create order function. And this takes in data and actions. But what we return at the end is basically using the actions, which is a create order actions property type, actually. You can see there's an order property which has create, and this is a function that basically makes a request to the PayPal API. And you can see it takes create order requests body. Looking at that, you can see all of the things you can pass in. And what we're going to pass in are purchase units, which, if we look at purchase units, contains an amount or a bunch of other things as well. So this amount extends the amount, which basically just has a currency and a value. That's it. So this might have been a little bit confusing, but basically, if you need to just understand all of the structure of the data that you're providing, you can look at all the components. But what this looks like in the end is we have a create order function, and this is going to take in the data and the actions as the values from the callback. And what we return at the end is actions.order.create, so using that API call. And this takes in options, which has purchase units, and those purchase units is an array of units, and we can specify the amount, which contains a currency and a value, but the currency you can also just leave out. So the value in this case, I'm going to put as 10, and take note that this is a string as well. It needs to be a string. So what we're doing here is calling the API, and it returns this order for an amount of 10. So if I come back here and I hit PayPal button, then I can log in, and make sure you're logging in. Again, this is the sandbox. Log in with your personal sandbox account, right? And then we can see $10 is the amount that we're paying, and we can use the PayPal balance, and you can then pay. Now we can hit pay and it will be successful, but we won't actually be notified in any way right now. So you can actually go and see in your account that the money has moved. So again, log into your business sandbox account and you'll see the amount was received. Likewise, if you go into the sandbox personal account, you'll see that you just paid $10. But again, in terms of the front end, we can't know for sure. So That's what we're going to do now, is add another function to handle the callbacks for when you cancel, or when there's a successful payment, or when there's an error. And so these methods you can all find on the PayPal buttons component, which is the on approve, and you have the on cancel, and you have the on error. Right, so these are the three methods that you can use to display messages to the user that indicate something happened. Now, just before we get to that, I'm going to use a component to help us display those messages. So again, just stopping the server there. Then I'm going to go back into the front-end folder because we need to install this package. And I'm just going to bring this package in here as well. This is the React Hot Toast package. It's really simple. So all we do is just npm install React Hot Toast, which we can do now. So coming over here, all right, we install that package. And once that's done, I'm actually just going to go back to build this so long. So we build the images again. And this is really simple. So what we do is we pass this toaster component in the root of the app component. So meaning if we come over here to app.tsx, then we can paste this right above there. And we just need to make sure we have the import, which we can actually click on GitHub. And then if we just scroll down here, you can import toaster from React Hot Toast. And like you see here, you have a toaster component. So copy that, and we'll just add that in here. Right, so there's our toaster. And then inside the payment component, we can then import the toast function. And this is how you will then call basically to create a message. So taking this toast, you can then do something like toast.error and then just pass in an error message. So like an example message, right? Or you can do a success message and you can pass in icons, you can style it however you want. So it's really good. It's quite a nice package for messages. So this is now finished building, so we can go and run that again. And so coming back to these three functions here, we'll basically use the toast component to display a message. So for example, on the cancel callback, we can just use an empty callback function and just say toast, and we'll say toast. We won't call the error function. We'll just make it a normal toast like this. And we'll say you canceled the payment, and you can then pass in some other arguments like the duration. So you could say make this 10,000, meaning 10 seconds. And if we come back to our app over here, if we click on the button and we can wait a little bit, or we can just close this, then you can see here you canceled the payment. All right. So that's how we can display cancellation messages. And then likewise for the on error function, we can do the same sort of thing. So this takes an error as one of the parameters, but it's not actually necessary, because at this point, if you're receiving an error here, then it's not really anything that you've done. It's just some kind of general error. So you can basically just return a generic error message. So you can say toast.error and say there was an error with your payment, and something like try again. And again, you can pass in all of these arguments here. Right. So if we get some kind of error, we'll see that display over here, but there's no way to really test this right now because we don't have any kind of generic issue going on. But that's how we can handle on error. And then lastly, we have the on approve. So on approve is slightly different, because what we need to do is make use of another actions method on the order, which is to capture the order. And this basically is used to display a confirmation to the user. This is not to be foolproof and to decide when to send the user an email or to grant them access to what they purchased. This is just to display a message. So what we need to do is grab the actions and, well, first the data and the actions from the callback. And we return another API call. So this is actions.order.capture. So we can see it there. And you can use an arrow function here as well. And you could say something like toast.success and say payment completed. And we could do something like, for example, thank you plus, and then add the details. And what's nice is you can actually see all the information here. So details.payer.name.given name. So this is the given name on the order. And that can then show you a nice personalized message that it was successful. Again, this is all we're doing here, is just displaying the message. So coming back here, if we go through the payment process again, hit the pay button, then we can see payment completed. Thank you, John, in this case. But okay, so that's how we can set up the React front end to at least display that the payment process either had an error or was canceled or was successful. But now we have to go to the backend side where we'll receive the webhook event and actually give access to the user. So to test webhooks, you're going to need to use an HTTPS URL. So a service like Ngrok is helpful because you can tunnel your local host to that HTTPS URL and just test the webhooks on your local environment through that URL. So I'd recommend downloading this. It is free. So you just have to have an account and then go through the steps here to download it, authorize it using your token, and then you can basically start a tunnel by calling ngrok and then HTTP port 8000 in our case because of the Django server being on 8000. So I would go and set that up, and once you have that set up, then inside a terminal, for example, if I just navigate to the right place, then I can run that ngrok on 8000 and you'll get an HTTPS URL, which is this, in my case, it's this link here. Now you'll see that it's not allowed on this host. So we need to copy this and come into our settings. So I'm just going to go to the top here and close this. So inside our local.py settings, we will then add that in there, and we don't need to add the HTTPS part, so just the host like that. And then we also need to specify this in our PayPal account as a webhook to send to. So if we go back to our apps and credentials, you got to go into that app that you're working with, which in my case is the default application. And then here we can add a webhook. We'll then paste our URL and we're going to put a path on the end of that, like for example, webhooks/PayPal. So that's where the Django view will be placed so that it handles requests on that path. And I'll just say all events and then scroll down to the bottom and hit save. Right, so that's going to send events to this path now. Now, once that webhook is created, it'll provide you with a webhook ID. You need to copy this ID because you're going to use it to verify events that are sent from PayPal. So the webhook ID along with your client ID and secret are the three values that you need to have inside Django. So coming into the Django side of things, we're going to create a payments app to hold all of the payment related logic, which will include the webhook. And so I'm going to do this in another terminal where I'm going to run a command, and this is using Docker Compose that we're running a Django manage.py command, which is to start an app, and we're going to call it payments. Now I'm doing this through Docker because the project is configured through Docker and not locally. So that'll then create the payments app, and we can see the folder generated here in the root of the project, but I'm going to move it into the Django React PayPal folder, and then we just need to change some of the configurations, like here in the apps.py. This is going to be Django React PayPal.payments, just to match the same configuration as the user's app, which looks like this, right? So that's the payments config there. And then we need to register this app in the settings. So inside our base.py, we can then scroll down to our local apps and basically copy and paste this. And this is going to be the payments config. Okay. Now inside base.py, we can also scroll down all the way to the bottom and we can add in our environment variables for PayPal, which includes the client ID, the client secret, and the webhook ID. So those are all now environment variables, and you're going to want to make sure that you put them inside your local Django environment variables. And then I'll add in my values over here. And in order to have that take effect, we also need to restart the Docker services because we need to read those environment variables in. So running that again, we can see now that the Django service is starting correctly. So those values are being read into the settings.py. Okay, so that's the first thing we need to do. The second thing we need to do, and I'm actually going to stop the Docker services again, and this is so that we can install a package, which is the PayPal REST SDK. And I'm going to put this into the requirements base.txt just here at the top. So this specifies version 1.13.1, and we can actually take a look at the repository here. Now this has been archived, but it is still usable. It's just they're not adding features or support, but it's basically just an integration with the API. So we're mainly going to be using this to verify webhooks because verifying them is quite complicated for you to do manually. So we're just going to use the built-in method to verify it for us. So just closing this and coming back here. Now that we have a new dependency, we need to build the images again. So I'm just going to let that build. And basically we can start with the Django view, which is inside the payments, views, and here we're going to create our view. Now I'm pasting this in here just because there's not a lot going on, but it's just a lot to type out. Basically what we're doing is checking if there's a header, which is in the request meta called HTTP PayPal transmission ID. And this always comes from PayPal. So if we don't have this value, then we don't bother checking if it's a valid webhook because it's not. And then after that, we can then access all the other headers, which include the transmission ID, the signature, the time. So we need to grab all of those values, as well as using our webhook ID, which we configured in the settings, and the event body, which is just being decoded using UTF-8. And we pass all these values into the notifications.webhook-event.verify function. So this calls the PayPal API, passed with all of the values that are required, and it returns whether or not it's valid. So if it is valid, then we keep going. If it's not valid, then we return a bad request. And all of this is imported as well from, you can see here from the PayPal REST SDK. I'm just getting linting issues from pylons, but these are all valid imports. And once we have the webhook event verified, we can then access it using json.loads, and then you can work with it like a normal Python dictionary. So in this case, I'm just printing the event type, so that will show us what event was actually sent to us. Now, with all of that there, make sure that we have this running. So we've finished the build. We'll now run the up command again. But now we need to bring this into our URLs. So going into config urls.py, we can say from the Django React PayPal.payments.views, and then import our process webhook view, and then put this on the path of the webhook that you set up. So for example, this would be webhooks PayPal, and then just .as view. And yeah, so that's all running. So now we will handle the requests sent on this URL or this path, and we can actually test the payment process and see what event is printed here. So if we come back and go through the payment process, once we paid, we see the message displayed there, and then coming back, we'll just need to wait a little bit because it takes maybe a minute or so just to receive the event from PayPal. So we'll wait to see what gets printed out. All right, there we can see checkout.order.approved. So that's the type of event. And that's basically what we're looking for. Whenever we receive that type of event, we will then send an email to the customer. And so again, I'm going to paste in some logic here to basically check if the event type is checkout order approved, then we'll then do the following. So we grab the email address from the event, which you can basically inspect by printing out the event. And you can then send a product link to that user's email. So we send the subject is your access, for example, with a message that says whatever you want to say. And then here's the link for whatever you purchased. And the idea is that this is some sort of private link, not something that just anyone could find by typing in the address. So again, that could be like Airtable, could be Notion or something. So you then send an email to that customer, and like that, they then have access to the product. Again, we can test this out and see that the email gets printed in the terminal. Right, and there we go. We can see it here. From your email sent to the personal email for PayPal, thank you for purchasing the product, and then there's the link to the product. So there we go. That is how we can set up PayPal payments using React and the webhooks in Django to grant access to some kind of digital product. So if you enjoyed the video, then consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.